environmentalism are found in the progressive republicanism of Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, and of course, that famous communist, John D. Rockefeller. Throughout the 1920s and right up to the 1960s, there was a bipartisan consensus in the United States about the importance of land preservation and environmental protection, so much so that when the Wilderness Act of 1964 designated over 9 million acres of American lands as areas where man is a visitor and does not remain, it passed the U.S. Senate by a vote of 73 to 12, and the U.S. House of Representatives by 373 to 1. In the 1970s, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, so reviled by the tobacco industry and so reviled by the fossil fuel industry today, was created by the Republican President Richard Nixon, who signed into law many of the key pieces of environmental legislation which became the framework of environmental protection in the United States and which inspired many comparable pieces of legislation around the world. But things began to change in the 1980s. They began to change right around the time of the emergence of that neoliberal consensus that I spoke about a few moments ago. And they also began to change when scientific evidence, work by scientists who were not environmentalists, who were not activists, but who were scientists studying the natural world, discovered certain things that they did not go looking for. The scientists who found the ozone hole were not looking for the ozone hole. The scientists who discovered acid rain were not looking for acid rain. The scientists who discovered global warming were not looking for global warming. Rather, they found these problems by doing scientific work, by trying to understand the complex natural world that we live in. But they discovered these problems, and when they did discover them, they realized that they required action. And they required action that seemed to be something that the government needed to get involved in, that we as individuals could not stop acid rain just by changing our own light bulbs. So these were problems that seemed to demand government action, that seemed to demand some form of regulation of business and economic activity. And these issues emerged by a piece of just plain bad historical bad luck, I would say, or what my historical colleagues would call a historical contingency. I call it bad luck. These issues emerged just as the Reagan administration in the United States and the Thatcher administration in the United Kingdom were arguing for less government and less regulation, precisely as advocated by Milton Friedman, shown here shaking hands at the White House with Ronald Reagan. So I would argue then, as a historian looking at this question, that this bad luck story of the emergence of the neoliberal consensus at the exact same moment that these scientific problems were coming to the fore put the Reagan administration and later the entire neoliberal consensus on a collision course with science, on a collision course with our future. Now, Ronald Reagan may have had a point. Government regulation is not the solution to every problem. And some environmentalists are socialists. In fact, I gave this talk in Melbourne at the State Library a few months ago, and at the end of the talk, a man in the front row stood up, puffed up his chest, and said, "I just want to be on record as saying that I am a watermelon." Fair enough. Moreover, the cutting edge of science is always unsettled. There is always uncertainty in any live scientific research area. There is always some room for healthy skepticism and reasonable doubt. But the question becomes, what's reasonable? And history then plays a role in helping to answer that question. Because history shows us that the rejection of the scientific evidence regarding DDT, acid rain, the ozone hole, and secondhand smoke wasn't based on reasonable scientific doubt. In fact, it wasn't based on scientific doubt at all. It was based on the desire to avoid government regulation of the products and activities that created these problems. History also showed us that DDT, nuclear winter, acid rain, the ozone hole, and the harms of tobacco were all real problems needing real solutions. Problems where the scientists got it right and the merchants of doubt got it wrong. There's a really weird kind of psychological thing going on now. When I lecture, sometimes people say things, or I get this in, when I do radio call-ins like I did this morning, well, I'm old enough to remember acid rain and the ozone hole, so I'm skeptical about climate change. And I stop and think, wait, how does that add up? Acid rain was a real problem that we fixed through government regulation, through an emissions trading system. The ozone hole was a real problem that we fixed through an international treaty and international cooperation. So how does that undermine climate change? There's this sort of really weird thing going on. So I think it's really important to point out that scientists were right about these previous issues. And the reason we don't worry about them anymore today is because we took steps to do something about them. Finally, and perhaps most important as we move forward to try to address the problem of global warming, history also shows us that free market capitalism, like any human institution, has its limits. So you don't have to be a socialist or communist to point out the problem of negative externalities. This is a term that economists have developed to describe costs that accrue to people who did not reap the benefits of the activities that generated them. That is to say, costs that are not reflected in the price of those goods, services, and activities. And environmental damage is the textbook example of a negative externality. And even Milton Friedman acknowledged that. This, then, is the common thread that unites these otherwise diverse issues, diverse science that were challenged by the emergence of Dow. That in every single case they involved negative externalities. In every case they involved a market failure, a situation where the market did not adequately reflect what was actually going on in the world. They were all examples of behaviors that generated large external costs and therefore provided potential warrant for government intervention in the marketplace. Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist of the World Bank, has called anthropogenic climate change the greatest and widest-ranging market failure ever seen. So given this framework, then, I think it helps us to understand why this issue has become politicized and why it's become politicized in precisely the way that it has. So it then becomes not surprising that environmentalists, Europeans, and those on the left of the political spectrum have been pretty quick to accept the reality of these problems, pretty quick to accept the scientific evidence, whereas conservatives, libertarians, and Americans, particularly U.S. Americans, have been rather slow to accept them. The U.S. Judge Richard Posner has pointed out that behavior that generates large external costs provides an apt occasion for government regulation. And this really, I think, is the shortest, pithiest summary of really what the issue at stake here is. That this behavior, our behavior, the way we use fossil fuels, has generated large external costs. And that leads logically to the conclusion that we do need some form of government regulation. And that conclusion is the one that Republicans and others in the United States and elsewhere refuse to accept. So rather than accept that conclusion, they attack the science. They attack the messenger. So how we feel about regulation then affects how we feel about the behavior, whether it's smoking or burning fossil fuels. We are all more likely to accept evidence consistent with our pre-existing worldviews. Posner also points out, however, that a rational decision maker starts with a prior probability, but adjusts that probability as new evidence comes to his or her attention. History tells us that scientists have known for a very long time that global warming from burning fossil fuels could occur. We have known this for more than 100 years. And now, for more than 20 years, evidence has been mounting that it is indeed occurring. Evidence that our scientists now tell us is unequivocal. And of course, it's important to point out, the energy market, the energy sector is not a free market. Indeed, according to the World Bank, working together with the OECD, the Institute for Energy, the International Energy Agency, and OPEC, global subsidies for the fossil fuel industry worldwide are estimated at $700 billion a year. $700 billion, that's 1% of total GDP. Most estimates of what it would cost to mitigate global warming are about 2 to 3% of GDP. So a third of what we need to fix this problem is going not to fix it, but to making it worse. And if you compare this, when you have figures like 700 billion, it's hard to get your head around what that really means. I always look for useful comparisons. So TARP, the Troubled Asset Recovery Program in the United States, otherwise known as the bank bailout, cost the U.S. taxpayer about $700 billion. So that means we are spending a TARP every year to bail out the fossil fuel industry. So why are we doing that? So to conclude, the Industrial Revolution was based on tapping the energy stored in fossil fuels. And it brought the Western world, the developed world, the industrialized nations, 150 years of unprecedented prosperity. Prosperity that our great-grandparents and great-grandparents couldn't even dream about. We in the developed industrialized world live with a level of comfort and wealth that kings in medieval Europe did not experience. It was a free lunch of historic proportions. And by and large, I think it's fair to say that it was, for the people who benefited and experienced, it was by and large a good thing. Not unalloyed, but by and large a good thing. Most of us lived longer, healthier lives than our grandparents or great-grandparents or great-grandparents did. But the lunch wasn't actually free. Global warming is the bill, and that is a bill that has now come due. And as Kim Stanley Robinson has pointed out, the invisible hand never picks up the check. Thank you very much.
Professor Oreskes, I'm sure, will be delighted to take questions, and we have 2 microphones that are going to be moving around in the audience. If you speak very loudly, you please just yell, and you won't need a microphone, but if you speak quietly, please use it.
But don't yell at me.
Mike, sure.
I have most of the writings of Richard Posner. He's not a scientist.
No.
And he's certainly not an economist. He's a judge of the 6th Court of Appeals. He's also professor of law in Chicago. Generally, as when you read writings about Posner, he's generally called a conservative.
Right.
So it's very strange for you to attack the conservatives and then quote one. But it gets even worse, because the quotation that you have held up, if I can paraphrase it, was to the fact, we start with prior probabilities and then deduct them on the basis of later evidence. I think that's the nub of it.
Right.
I cannot make sense of either of that. First, I have not a clue how you arrive, in the first place, at the prior probabilities. They're obviously prior,
Right.
but how do you pick this prior probability rather than that one, rather than that one, rather than that one, rather than that one? All they have in common is they're all prior. Much good that does us. And then how do you adjust the prior probabilities? How do you adjust them? Is this supposed to be some kind of Bayes theorem? If so, there is a vast literature on Bayes theorem. That's the only way that I know from my math training. And that strikes me as creating even bigger problems. So I don't think you should have that quotation from Posner unless you've got a huge amount of literature behind it, a large part of it being from Bayes' theorem, which strikes me, unless you have some other math up your sleeve, being the only way that we know of in the last 200 years, since Bayes was an 18th century mathematician,
right.
to really adjust prior probabilities. But we know there's a vast controversy. I mean,
Okay, I think I get the point. Okay, so let me just say 2 things. First of all, I'm not attacking conservatives. What this project was all about was trying to understand the roots of the conservative opposition to evidence, to scientific evidence. Why would a principled person, conservative, liberal, or anything else, reject scientific data? That's really the question. So what we were trying to get at is here we had a group of people who created the think tank, which was a self-acknowledged conservative think tank. I mean, these men called themselves conservatives. And they began to launch these attacks on scientific evidence. And so that's what we were really trying to get at. And so this is an attempt to understand that story. I drew on Posner because he is a conservative, and because it's interesting to me, because I think Posner is a principled conservative. I think he's a person who's actually grappling with this project in a thoughtful way, because he doesn't like regulation, because his instinct is to not want to see the government intervene in the marketplace. But he has concluded, based on the experiences of the last several years, which include both the global financial crisis and the question of the negative externalities associated with climate change, that sometimes the government really does need to intervene. And so the question becomes how you decide when the government needs to intervene. And I think what Posner is trying to say, and I think he is drawing on Bayes, and he's not a mathematician, you're absolutely right, neither am I, although I've certainly read a fair amount about Bayes and his work, and I'm familiar with some of the debates about it. But he's simply trying to say, look, we all come to any issue with assumptions. So lots of conservatives came to the issue of climate change assuming that it wasn't true, assuming that it was exaggerated or false or no big deal, or the technology would solve the problem or we could adapt to it. And that assumption was based on worldviews, based on the assumption that ceteris paribus, it's better for the government not to intervene in the marketplace. But then the evidence begins to mount. And the dangers and the hazards begin to become more and more apparent. And so I think Posner is speaking for himself there and his own thought process and saying, I used to be skeptical about this, but now I see the evidence. I see the enormous amounts of scientific evidence, and I've got to adjust my worldview in response. So I think that's all he's trying to say, and I thought it was a rather articulate expression of that principled way of thinking about the problem And the fact that it came from someone who is known as a conservative, I thought was rather admirable. So it was my way of trying to give